We are so glad that you're here, and we're ready to start our webinar this morning. So good morning or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. My name is Greg Forster, and I am the director of the Oikonomia Network, which is a network of theological educators and seminaries. We are dedicated to connecting the theological education to the way people actually live in the advanced modern world. So we talk a lot about whole life discipleship, living all of our lives for Jesus. And that brings us into conversations about things like fruitful work and working for the common good, economic wisdom, and human flourishing. But we also steward a number of conversations about the future of theological education. And that's what we're here to talk about today in our webinar. So we're very glad to have you with us. I want to quickly remind you to please set your Zoom to mute when you are not speaking. We had an observation in our last webinar. As a teacher, I hate telling people mute yourself. So instead, we'll say, please set your Zoom to mute if you are not speaking. We are in a series of webinars that we've been having this spring called From Information to Formation, reflecting the fact that theological education is reinventing itself from a model that emphasized acquiring information as the center of education to a model that emphasizes acquiring a formation of who we are and what our capacities as people are at the center of education. With that, so this is our last webinar of the spring. We will, however, have some future opportunities, and I will tell you a little about those at the end of our time today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here at Trinity, Donald Guthrie, who is going to be facilitating the webinar today. So Donald, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning or afternoon, everybody. As Greg said, we're talking about an interesting topic for this third webinar of the spring. It's called Embracing the Slash. This, what seems to be an increasing necessity for faculty members to take on all kinds of other things in addition to their teaching roles. I'm joined today by Jessie Swigart from Covenant Theological Seminary, Philip Thompson from Sioux Falls Seminary, and Scott Ray from Talbot School of Theology. So thanks to you guys for joining us for the conversation. Let me just start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your role at your school. First, maybe a little bit of description about what it entails. And Jessie, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I am Dean of Academic Administration at Covenant. And so I work very closely with the Vice President of Academics. And things that fall into my area of responsibility include assessment of student learning across the degree programs. It includes course planning and making sure that we are offering the courses that we need to offer and that we have people to teach them, care for our part-time professors and our online program, and just generally making sure that things are running the way that they are supposed to run. That takes probably between 85%, probably 80 to 85% of my time. And the other part is I teach educational ministries and at the seminary as well.
Okay, great. Scott, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Donald. Delighted to be with all of you this morning or this afternoon. I serve three different roles at Talbot School of Theology. Since we are embedded in Biola University, all of us in the School of Theology have some roles in contact with the broader university. So I serve as Dean of Faculty for the School of Theology, which is essentially the number 2 spot. I'm not where the buck stops, but I'm a lot closer to it than I was before. I also teach a modicum of classes. I teach ethics in the business school and then Christian ethics in the School of Theology. And then I also serve as a senior advisor to Biola's president for a university mission, which is a university-wide role. I'm doing that for the last 3 years. So the two leadership roles probably take Jessie, like you, 80 to 85% of my time.
Great, thanks. And Philip, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Philip Thompson, and I was, at one time, I was acting dean here at Sioux Falls Seminary during an earlier time in our school's history. We are engaged in a really radical rethinking of education, theological education, and how institutions operate. So even before the webinar, I was pondering how even to speak of what we do here. So I am a faculty member. I'm also a mentor in our contextual program, which is all that we are just about. But also, in a way, we have tried to transcend slashes, because slashes can work very well functionally. You do this and that, but slashes can also become territorial and need mediating across the various, faculty, administration, etc. Board. So we are in the process of radically rethinking what governance looks like to a more collaborative model. And so so that's where I live and move and serve and do my thinking and work. So you may get to hear me think out loud some today.
Great, yeah. Well, why don't we keep going on this line? Can you think a little bit more out loud, both, not just Philip, but Scott and Jessie, about how your role contributes to your school's mission? What place does it have? Collaborative, team, office, wherever you want to take that. Scott, let's go back to you first on this one.
Well, a big part of that is pretty easy to answer, because the title for my role with the president's office is an advisor to the president for university mission. So that's a lot of what I spend my time thinking about. How are we working to keep our institution from drifting from its mission? What things proactively can we do to make sure that we stay on mission amidst all of these incredible changes that are coming? We found that it's really easy to get wrapped up in the sort of the nature of the beast with the changes that are taking place, and forget about maintaining fidelity to our mission in the midst of these changes. So in our view, we want only not just to survive the pandemic and survive the changes that are coming. We want to flourish in the midst of that. And for us to do that involves, I think, first and foremost, continuing to be faithful to the mission that God's called us to.
Great, thank you. Philip, how about you?
Well, I appreciate what Scott said about being faithful to the mission, because one of the things that seems to befall institutions is their own continued existence becomes their reason for existence. The mission tends to become institution centric, and so we are working to reconceive even the existence of the theological school along a more discipleship model of those who seek to save their lives will lose it, and those who give away their lives will receive it. And so for this reason, we try to be very non-competitive, but the health of the institution is bound up in the health of the mission of serving and forming disciples for the kingdom service. And that's led to a lot of changes for us.
Yeah, how about you, Jessie?
Yeah, in my role, and I'm not the only one who has this vantage point in the institution, but I am one person who you get a broader view of the system, and you see the stress points You see where things seem to be flourishing and going well, and places where maybe it's not that it's not flourishing, but you see more stress in certain points. And what that forces you to do, it forces you to be asking, okay, why are we doing what we're doing? And is what we're doing actually moving us forward in the mission that we want to be serving? And so for me, where I am looking at policies and resources and even doing things like assessment and online, you have to be continually asking those questions and saying, okay, why are we doing what we're doing? Who could be, who is currently blessed? Who could be blessed in addition if we did things a little bit differently? And is this in line with why we are here?
Okay. Before we move to the next topic area of your own calling, I want to remind the folk who are live here, if you have a question, we'll have some time at the end of our time together to address some of your questions. So if you have questions you want our panelists to take up, you can just put them in the chat, and we'll get to them in a little while. Okay. Back to the conversation. Let's think about your own reception of your calling in your school. How have you come to it? How has it come to you? How do you find personal satisfaction in serving the institutions that you serve and the way in which you serve them? Scott, let's go back to you. Would you start for us, please?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because that's one that I've wrestled with since being in these multiple roles. I spent 20 plus years in what I call teach, write, and otherwise leave me alone mode. And it was wonderful. And I would have been perfectly happy to continue in that mode for the duration. But what has surprised me a bit about being in these leadership roles, and I'm calling them leadership instead of administrative. That's the story I'm telling myself at the moment. And it seems to be helping. But what surprised me a bit was how much satisfaction I've gotten out of the work of generating institutional change and being a part of that. I've worked harder in those areas in the last 10 years than I have in the previous 20, because it's much harder work, and I didn't learn much in my graduate study about how to do these kinds of things. So I've had to pick up a lot of this stuff on the fly, and I've learned from mistakes that have been made. But it's been very satisfying to look back on the last 10 years or so and see the changes in our institution that I've been a part of. As a part of teams, to be sure. But I think still, I'm an academic at heart. Most of the things that are the most life-giving for me are the things that have to do with my academic field. But I've done more than just tolerate the slash. I think it's fair to say that I've embraced it, in part because, I benefited from leaders when I was younger on the faculty who invested their lives so that I could teach, write, and otherwise be left alone. And I realized I felt like I had an obligation to pay that back to the next generation of faculty who were coming up the ranks at Talbot. And so I felt an obligation to provide for them some of the great things that had been provided for me. And so I stepped into that role. In fact, before I stepped into these roles, I had, anybody who had noticed that I had any kind of administrative ability, I swore them to secrecy, and said, just please don't tell anybody about that. But I've embraced the roles and I've become a lot more comfortable in them. Although I still navigate the desire to teach and be around students, because that's the real thing that still is the most life-giving for me. So to keep my sanity, I have to be around students. I have to be doing some writing, although the writing has really suffered pretty significantly since entering these roles.
Okay, thanks. Jessie, any resonance with what Scott's saying there?
I would say yes, in that I think there are very few people who enter administration and theological education purposefully or intentionally. Very few people mean to end up where we ended up. I started, well, at first I was a student at Covenant, and then I started as an administrative assistant. And I gradually accumulated more and more responsibility. I think that's a common story of you take on responsibility because there is a need, and then you take on more responsibility, and then you take on more responsibility, and before you know it, you are a theological educator and administrator. I think what's a little bit different about my story is that administration was somewhat of a starting place for me. When I started working at Covenant, I thought I might be there a year or two on my way to something else. But what I discovered was the opportunity in administration to really serve and bless others in the institution. You have tools pretty powerful tools at your disposal to bless. And alongside of that, I entered a PhD program. So I was developing the scholarly skills of study and inquiry and communication alongside the practice of growing in administrative skills. And to kind of, there's like a meeting point where expertise in administration and, as a early emerging scholar, those things coming together at the same time for me, which may be a little bit different than what than Scott and Philip's stories.
Great. Like Philip, you said earlier, you were in the dean's office for a bit. You guys have, I think you're transitioning. It doesn't sound like it's a done deal yet at Sioux Falls. So how would you respond to both the past and I guess the present?
Yeah, that's a great question, Donald, and I appreciate what Scott and Jessie have said, and yeah, it's we are always. I mean, we're in a constantly iterative process where we never stop asking questions about what we're doing. But I would say, what they were describing sounds sort of like what I was doing when I was acting dean, except for the fact that I was in a more dysfunctional system. When the system is working well, then what they were describing sounds really good. Part of the way in which we brought greater health into our system is through this flattening out. So, for instance, Jessie earlier was talking about assessment and program development and various things like that. These are conversations that we have as an entire system. There are not siloed conversations. So, for instance, we don't have faculty meetings. We have meetings of the entire organization on a regular basis. And so everyone, board members and also staff are present there with faculty, with administrators. And likewise, except for the rare executive session, everyone is welcome at the board meetings. And so everyone speaks into all aspects of the process, which is it is disruptive, and it is a bit unsettling. On the other side, though, and this is where it's a kind of providential thing for me to be where I am and to do what I do, because I just naturally incline toward integration and the integration of interdisciplinary thought. Um, these are the conversations that lead to possibilities emerging that may not have otherwise. And so it's really beneficial, for instance, for those of us who teach the courses to be aware of what the challenges are in assessment and student retention and admissions and things like that. And we all work on those. We work on everything together, even though there are certain traditional areas where there is authority that inheres in various parts of the organization. But power and authority are not co-equally defined for us. And so, yeah, it is, as you can hear it is a bit disruptive and it can be a little bit bewildering, but it also is one of those times where we very frequently experience the Spirit's life-giving presence.
Okay, that kind of leads us actually into the next couple of questions about the challenges, both in the role and in the system, as you experience them. How's that gone for you? What have you find to be most helpful? Who helps? Who's conversation partners? Scott, maybe back to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. I appreciate the challenge to just inject some, at least in my case, a note of reality into this too, because it was a tough transition. Leaving the classroom full time was really hard to do. And now, fortunately, we had jumped on to the online uh, modality a little earlier before that, and so I've actually been continuing to teach, but without having to be professor of record in several classes. So that that's not any more satisfying for me, but it's not like I've given up teaching entirely. And I don't know that I can do that and still maintain my sanity in the midst of this. But I think the biggest challenge is there's just simply too much to do, and not enough time to do it, and too many hats to wear. And so the big challenge for me has just been prioritizing the things that are most important in the long run, as opposed to the things that are screaming at me the loudest to get done. And typically, those things that are screaming the loudest are not always the most important things that have to be done. And so, I try to set aside time for thinking and reflection. I remember my seminary mentor told me, he said, if you're not spending at least 25% of your time thinking, you're kidding yourself that you're a leader. And so, I'm not at the 25% level, but I'm trying hard to set aside time just to think and reflect and to figure out, where are we going with this? I have a very close relationship with our academic dean. We talk almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. He's been probably the best conversation partner in this because we assumed our roles at roughly the same time, because Talbot turned over its senior leadership about the same time, roughly 10 years ago. So we talk frequently. We are the best sounding board for each other. I say that's been the most helpful thing. We have a very good team of people who get along. We get along very well. We work together well, and we generally have a faculty who are easy to get along with. We've worked really hard to try and not hire people who have some of those narcissistic tendencies that sometimes go with people who are in the knowledge business. So the people for whom it's all about them and all about their work, we've tried to stay away from those folks and cultivate a bit more of what we call a culture of humility. That's been really helpful because we've recruited faculty who generally play well with others and share the sandbox well. So the times that we've had to sort of we just have not had to be heavy-handed very often. So that, I think that's been really helpful, and has sort of kept me from pulling my hair out, like I suspect some in other institutions are finding themselves doing.
Sure. Philip, I'm wondering if your stint in the dean's office uh, has led to you being a bit more of a go-between, or if you, as you settled back into faculty role with, like you're talking about, lots of people at the table, lots of tables that people are at. How does that continue to be a challenge, I guess, is
Yeah,
what I was thinking.
it's a great question, and there was that kind of mediating work when I was in the dean's office. In fact, one of the things that I just stumbled upon that I just didn't even think about it, but it turned out to be a real blessing, is I kept my office on the faculty hall instead of moving into the dean's office for that year, which would have put me closer to the administration. And I was amazed by how many colleagues appreciated just that kind of physical symbol of being with the faculty. And that really underscored how much there was a kind of the role of fostering communication was very important. I don't think there's as much of that kind of mediating function now, simply because we have tried to take down the walls. We've knocked down the silos, so to speak. But what I think we cultivate, and I can play a role in this, where Scott, I think, very helpfully mentioned the virtue of humility. For us, I think our great virtue is the practice of hospitality. And so in our institutional conversation, our aim is not to exclude any source of light and to hear every voice equally. No one, by reason of what they do in the organization, is either privileged or excluded from any conversation. And so in the sense that we are fostering that kind of mutual openness to one another, perhaps maybe I do that more just as that's how I function naturally, not so much what came out of that year of sitting in the faculty office turned dean's office. But it is a really it's a good place to be in. I would say that.
That's very good. Jessie, what would you want to add about this one?
I would just add, I think, to what Scott has said, and what it sounds like Sioux Falls is really trying to cut against, is being a leader and an administrator can be a very lonely job. And because even as you maintain relationships, there are sometimes there are problems, and you see people groaning under the weight of those problems. And as a leader or an administrator, you're not someone they are commiserating with, you are someone they are complaining to. And especially as a faculty member who was, you feel like these are your people, and now they are complaining to you, that can feel that can be devastating at times and very lonely. And so for the importance of friendships among administrators, or among administrators and faculty, is very important, and I would say even crucial. Also, for the leader administrator to be vulnerable is important, but that is something that, as you are embracing the / something you have to navigate. To be vulnerable, it really helps for people to see how you make decisions and see the different things that you are weighing as you are trying to forge a path forward. At the same time, you want people to continue to come to you, and you want people to feel free in stating what they see. And even you want people to be able to complain to you. So you don't want to make your burdens their burdens. You don't want to give the impression that they are burdening you, even as you are vulnerably showing the weight of all that you are trying to consider. Another reason why sincere friendships is so important for the faculty administrator.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, thanks. Hey, let me remind folks, if you have a question, in a few minutes, we'll get to your questions as you have them. Just put them in the chat. One of my last questions is about kind of a broader direction of theological education in the coming years. Things were already moving in a direction towards formation being a key theme in theological education. Dan Alshire's new book certainly discusses that, as we all know. And the pandemic, as always, acting as accelerant, has probably pushed us further down the line. But I wonder what you all think about, and maybe even what your hopes are for theological education in the future, post-pandemic. Philip, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. We are, we're very actively engaged in trying to rethink theological education. And so I think what I would like to see, and what I think we were already doing it, the pandemic probably in some ways intensified it, is that not only formational emphases are at the fore, but also context, and not simply in a sense of the student doesn't have to come to a central physical campus, but one of the things we say is the context is the curriculum, that the Christian faith, being an incarnational faith, is embodied in different ways. And so our student who is nearing the end of her program, who's on the Orkney Islands off the northeast of Scotland, look, the way in which she has to think about the Christian faith is not going to be identical with our student who's in Taiwan, or our students who are in Brazil or Peru, or in Canada. And so really to allow the context to become the curriculum, I think I think it's one of the things that we're doing that I hope will come to mark theological education more broadly. Again, spreading things out and decentering. I think that's in many ways a good thing.
Yeah, thanks. Jessie, what are you seeing, and what are you hoping for coming up?
Yeah, I think in the context of North America, as Christianity is, you could say that there's a decentering of Christianity from the public square, that we need to remember something that has always been true, which is that as Christians, we are missionaries in our culture, a missional approach to our culture. And what does that truth mean for how we do theological education? I think in one sense is that perhaps as traditional seminaries in North America, we have a sense of entitlement that we get to be here, we should be here, we belong here, which by God's grace, we are here. But we need to be continually thinking, how are we forming our students to show God's kingdom in the world? And what does being a missionary in our own culture, how does that shift how we think about theological education? We need to be looking at our brothers and sisters from around the world who have been in this place more viscerally than we have. We need to learn from them, follow in their footsteps, and figure out how to be flexible for that mission, instead of wishing that mission would conform itself to who we are and how we are built to serve.
Thank you. Scott, observations, hopes from you?
Yeah, Donald, my hope for the future of theological education is sort of it's coordinated a bit with what I perceive as a I think in our churches, I think in the future we're going to see fewer full-time professional pastoral staff positions opening up, and I think we will, for lack of a better term, I think we're going to see more people who are in pastoral ministry who do it bivocationally, and who just who are just involved in substantial leadership in their church but are not being paid for it. And my hope is that substantive theological education for those people who are working full time in the marketplace can become accessible and affordable, so that the cost and the time commitment is not a deterrent for a much broader group of folks who really want further theological education, but just can't find space or money to be able to do that. And I think, Jessie, to your point about the locus of the church's activity shifting more to south of the equator and more to the developing world, I think we have an enormous opportunity ahead of us. But I don't know too many seminaries that are well positioned to provide the kind of broad scale, non-degree theological education at a cost that's affordable in the developing world. So that's my hope, is that we can get to that place where, from everything we hear from the church in the developing world, what they are starving for the most is leadership that has theological education. We say we have a huge opportunity, and I hope we don't miss it.
Thanks for that, Scott. I'm going to stick with you. Thanks for your questions you've submitted. There's a question for you, Scott, about maybe some lessons you've learned from the mistakes you've made as you've led change. You said you've devoted quite a bit of your time to the system, particularly the last number of years. What have you learned? A failure is a terrible thing to waste. So
yeah, I knew as soon as I said that, I knew somebody was going to ask me to pursue that further. So Brittany, I appreciate the question. I think that the big lesson I've learned is that how much, let me put it this way, that the more substantive the change, the more relational walk in the halls you have to do to facilitate it. 10 years ago, when we first started this foray into online teaching, we had so many faculty who were just resistant to it. Some of them were getting close to retirement, but some of them said, this isn't, I didn't go get a PhD to sit in front of a computer screen. I did this so I can, interact with live students face to face. And so we just, I spent hours and hours. Eventually, once I learned that I had to cultivate this persuasion with these faculty members, sort of one person at a time, and show them how it could be done, and to walk with them into the studio to get this stuff filmed. And as it turned out, some of the people who have been the most ardent opponents of online teaching are now some of its biggest fans. But it didn't, I didn't start out that way. And so what I had to learn is that the relational component, that has to be foundational, especially the more significant the institutional change.
Thanks, Scott. Philip, there's a question that anybody else can respond to, but I'm thinking particularly about what you were talking about earlier about hospitality, and the need for it, particularly as you have true shared governance. I mean,
right.
as you're experimenting
Right.
with the conversations you're having, are there particular structures, practices, rules of engagement that you all have found particularly helpful?
Well, I don't know about structures, but certainly practices. And as Scott was saying, the bigger the change, the more relational you have to be. And that is, I mean, we are changing on a scale of magnitude that I never would have imagined about 8 years ago. And so relationship is very important. We're adding legacy partners into our network. And so we have now many new colleagues. We have our legacy partners in Alberta, of course, South Dakota, Pennsylvania, Texas, and then we also have a faculty spread around the world. And so, so in all of our meetings, we also have times where we are broken into smaller discussion groups where we just get to know one another, to listen to one another's dreams, aspirations, concerns, etc. Like the old Baptist hymn, we share each other's woes, our mutual burdens bear. And then we come together, and the conversations become one large conversation. And so so in fostering that deep level of sharing as we seek to find our way along the way, that's very helpful. In simply, I mean, in part because we can't just we want to get together for a big picnic. We can't do that. So how do we bring what we can do into the process? So relationship is every bit as much important. Relationship building is every bit as much important as is strategic planning and envisioning and planning and creating. So.
Thanks. Just last question, maybe each of you a quick word, an encouragement that you would offer to a colleague who's considering such a role. Something you would encourage them to consider, think about, pray over. Jessie, we'll start with you.
Maybe one thing I would say is, what is something in the system that has been a burden on your heart or a question in your mind? And how could embracing the slash, taking an administrative responsibility, how could that put you in a place to pursue that further?
Great, thanks. Philip, how about you? An encouraging word to a colleague?
Well, I would encourage all of my colleagues and potential colleagues, if you are the kind who enjoys being part of a great adventure of a new thing, then the way we're seeking to approach theological education and even the life of theological schools gives many opportunities for that. And so I know that's very specific just to us. That's not a very transportable thing, but hopefully we're beginning to envision new ways that will be a leaven within a larger lump.
Sure. Scott?
To be honest, I'm a little skeptical of people who aspire to these positions of leadership in theological education, because I've seen, in a wide variety of play, we've all seen people who aspire to this for the wrong reasons. And so I guess my encouragement would be, look really carefully at your heart and why you want to do this. And, does it, are you leaving the thing that you trained to do? And, are you getting, just to think, I guess, think really carefully about making that step. Now, I think we're all, I think, increasingly going to be asked to shoulder more and more leadership types of things. Whether we do that with the majority of our time or not is a different question. But I think so I guess part of my encouragement would be just sort of everybody get used to this all hands on deck all the time view of what leadership in theological education is going to take, because the job is too big for one or two people to do. And it needs, sort of, Philip, what you're describing is this being decentralized in terms of these monumental changes that are coming and that we've all begun to embrace. But because everybody's going to have to do their share, and there will be people who will be at the top of the pyramid in terms of authority. But I would be careful just to watch your heart for what's motivating you to want to consider this.
It's a good word to end on. Philip, Scott, Jessie, thank you so much for your wisdom and pitching in to help the rest of us think about this important reality in our midst. Greg, back to you.
Yes, and I echo thank you, Scott and Jessie and Philip, for being with us. This was a very encouraging conversation, and one that we hope has been helpful to all of you and to everybody who will watch on the video later. Want to let you know about a couple of future opportunities. First of all, these webinars have been a real treat and a blessing. So we are planning, if the Lord wills it, to continue having them in the fall. So if we haven't made those plans finalized yet, but if you sign up for our monthly newsletter, if you don't already receive it, you will be kept up to date on everything that we do, including future webinars like this one. You can easily sign up, and it's totally free at oikonomianetwork.org. Just right on the front page, we have the sign up box. So oikonomianetwork.org, and if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll be kept up to date on everything we're doing. But another future opportunity we want to make sure you know about, we have our annual gathering, and we are coming back to doing it in person, which is very exciting. It will be this November 18 to 19 in Fort Worth. It will be right after the ETS meeting and right before the AAR meeting that's happening in San Antonio, with plenty of time to make it over if you're headed there. Or if you're not able to travel, you can join the meeting by Zoom. We have a bunch of really exciting speakers, so you can check that event out at karamforum.org, where we have the website for that event. And we have a lineup, and the focus is on justice and discipleship this year. So check that out. We hope that will be an opportunity for you. And until we see you again in some future endeavor, thanks very much for being with us, and have a great day.